For years, many Western nations have allowed millions of third world immigrants to cross their borders, including many who have no interest in assimilating into Western culture. They bring their own set of beliefs with no regard for the rule of law in their new homeland.
He was 24 years old. I wasn't the first child yet, and I certainly weren't the last.
Over 250,000 children, roughly 86 years. Those are the staggering, horrifying numbers circulating the internet right now. Elon Musk amplified it, politicians are weaponizing it, and everyone is fighting over it. And guess what the internet did? Instead of focusing on the systemic police failures or the protection of future victims, everybody started wondering about the perpetrators' nationalities. Why? Why did this horrific case turn into a moral debate about immigration? It genuinely made me wonder, are we actually this shallow? And then I remembered something. Not a statistic or a headline, but a comment from my last video. One that raised a serious doubt within me. One that made all of this feel less obvious. But to understand why, we first have to look at what actually happened in the UK. A group-based child sexual exploitation network operating across the UK was exposed through whistleblowers and countless victims finally coming forward. The stories were horrific. Authorities had seemingly known for decades. But instead of believing the desperate pleas of the many victims, they were labeled as prostitutes. Some of those prostitutes were 10 years old. Calls for help were ignored, lives were destroyed, and the failures didn't stop there. Investigations were delayed because officials feared being accused of racism when reporting demographic patterns among parts of the network. That hesitation had consequences. More victims subjected to more cruel abuse, more lives permanently shattered. At first, that explanation felt almost straightforward. Political correctness had produced institutional cowardice. A fear of saying the wrong thing had become more important than protecting children. It sounded plausible. It even felt convincing, but something kept bothering me. Not because the failures weren't real, they absolutely were, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. Then I started reading the discussions online and almost immediately the victims disappeared. Suddenly everyone was arguing about immigration, about multiculturalism, about demographics, about racism. One side insisted that this proved the inevitable downfall of multicultural societies, that some cultures were fundamentally incompatible with the West, that the brutality of these crimes justified treating an entire demographic with suspicion. The other warned that these crimes would immediately be weaponized to condemn millions of people and subject them to senseless violence, that focusing on ethnicity would fuel hatred against people that had absolutely nothing to do with these crimes. Both sides were looking at the same event, yet they seemed to be having completely different conversations. And that's when my own certainty began to crack, because I caught myself asking a question that I never expected to ask. Could this actually be a compelling argument against immigration? I hated that the question even crossed my mind. After all, around 85% of the perpetrators identified in several of these networks were British Pakistani men. The institutional failures were real. The demographic pattern was statistically proven. So why did I still feel uncomfortable? And then I caught myself doing exactly what everyone else was doing. I wasn't thinking about the victims anymore. I wasn't thinking about the police or the whistleblowers. I was thinking about the argument. Did you notice how quickly that happened? Within minutes, a story about abused children became a story about immigration. Not because the victims suddenly mattered less, but it felt like the political argument was becoming the bigger story. And that's the part I couldn't stop thinking about, because every discussion seemed to present the exact same choice. Either you're evil, or you're ignorant. Either you're destroying the country or trying to drag it back into medieval times. Nothing in between. I won't sugarcoat it. This specific case was a complete and utter failure of every authority involved. But after thinking about it for days, I realized that that actually wasn't the question I couldn't answer. The question that kept bothering me was much simpler. Why did all of us, including me, stop thinking about the victims so quickly? Remember that feeling of unease I mentioned in the beginning? I think you've probably experienced it too. Imagine you are in a relationship. Something feels off. Your partner seems distant. Maybe they're suddenly protective of their phone. You tell yourself that you're overthinking it. Weeks go by. Eventually, curiosity wins. You check their messages. Nothing. No betrayal. No affair. Nothing. Instantly, you're hit with an unbelievable wave of guilt. But almost immediately, another thought appears. I had to do it. I was protecting myself. It worked. For a brief moment, that explanation feels comforting. Not because your insecurity disappeared. It didn't. You simply replaced uncertainty with something concrete. That was the feeling I couldn't stop coming back to. not just in relationships, but also in this UK scandal. And maybe in politics more broadly, because I started wondering whether we're trying to do the exact same thing. Not excuse what happened, not deny what happened, but to make sense of something that felt impossible to process. Thinking back to the UK scandal, one thing suddenly stood out to me. The public conversation couldn't seem to hold two ideas at once. That a specific criminal network existed within a subculture of British Pakistani men, and that millions of immigrants had absolutely nothing to do with those crimes. Those two ideas should be able to coexist. Yet, everyone seemed to demand a choice. Either immigration was the problem, or talking about immigration was the problem. There was no room for anything in between. And I don't think it's just a political problem. I think it's a human one. Watching all of this, I started wondering whether we have a tendency as humans to reach for one clean explanation. Something we can point to, something we can name. Because uncertainty is exhausting. Maybe that's why it feels so comforting to give fear a face, even if that explanation ultimately tells only part of the story. And that's the uncomfortable part, because even if you think you're immune to those kinds of shortcuts, think again. I saw it in my own comment section. People watched one video and decided I had to be a liberal, or a communist, or a socialist. Then they watched another one. Suddenly I was betraying the left. It really annoyed me, until I realized I had been doing the exact same thing. I caught myself becoming more cautious around people I couldn't immediately understand. Not because they did anything wrong, but because I couldn't predict them. I didn't know their customs, or their culture, or their way of thinking. And uncertainty has a strange way of activating instincts that we like to believe we're normally above. Now, don't get me wrong, this video isn't meant to make you suspicious of your own thoughts. It's meant to remind you that having those thoughts doesn't automatically tell you who you are. What matters is what you do with them. Because this pattern seemed to appear in a myriad of different situations. In relationships, in comment sections, in politics, and especially after tragedies. I noticed how quickly I reached for certainty in those moments, even after becoming aware. I practically started dividing the world into us versus them, good and evil, safe and dangerous, because simple stories make frightening situations feel more predictable. But they're still only stories, and while we are arguing over which story feels better, real people are suffering. And somewhere in all of this, it felt like the victims were disappearing beneath yet another political battlefield. That's the real tragedy I kept coming back to. Not that people disagreed, but that the disagreement itself became more important than the people whose lives have been destroyed. Maybe embracing nuance doesn't make you weak. Maybe sitting with uncertainty doesn't mean you're naive. Maybe it's the only way to stop fear from dictating what reality looks like. Because the moment we demand that the world becomes simpler than it really is the moment the victims disappear for a second time. At least, that's what I noticed.